My grandfather sent me a birthday card. It had some rumpled up cash in it, and in his rough-hewn handwriting, he had written, "Be good to your people." When my mom saw this, she howled with laughter. "Be good to your people," she said. She thought this was very funny, because of the many things that my grandfather was known for, being good to your people was not one of them. I didn't really know that. I was a kid, and he had been gone quite a while at that point. I do remember that my grandparents had a train caboose in their yard, a big red dilapidated train caboose that sat up on blocks in their yard. My grandmother called it the Crummy. Now, to my brother and I as kids in the 1980s, this was totally awesome. It was a great thing to climb on and play. There were doors on either side, and there was also a ladder on each side. So you could go up to the roof of the train caboose. And then, you know that part that sticks out on the top of a train caboose? It's called the cupola. You could go in the windows of the cupola and go into the seats, and you can go down another ladder and run in and out. It was like a mildly dangerous wonderland for us. When I was talking to my uncle about this story, I learned something I didn't know. He told me that crummy is actually railroad slang for a caboose because they didn't usually get a lot of attention. They weren't very well cared for. So I asked him, did she call it the crummy because of railroad slang, or did she call it the crummy because it was this big, awful, dilapidated thing in her yard? And he didn't miss a beat. He said, "Well, yeah." My grandparents, Bud and Edith, met in 1939 at the Turnpike Dance Hall just south of Lincoln, Nebraska. My grandmother had grown up in a house with like 10 brothers and sisters, so she needed to get a job and, fend for herself. And she did. She was a hairstylist downtown. It was a good job. Bud worked at the dairy with his dad. You can only imagine that he was taken with her right away. She was small and smart and sassy. And you can only imagine that she was taken with him right away. He was tall and had these movie star good looks, even though he was already going bald. I feel like there are an endless number of these stories of people who meet in the 1930s at like a dance, and then they go on a date, and then they get married, and then they're married forever. There's no Tinder, there's no swiping right, it is just dance, date, done. There's a picture of them on their wedding day. Don't they look happy? He's like a foot taller than her, and she's in heels. My grandmother loved this picture, and she liked to point out that in the background, behind them, is an old outhouse. She said this was a sign that their marriage was going to wind up in the crapper. Bud got a better job on the railroad. He was a fireman. That doesn't mean that he put out fires. It meant that he kind of started fires. He shoveled the coal into the steam engine to make the steam engine go. This was a very good job, and he made a lot more money, but he had to be gone for long stretches of time away from home. My uncle said that his absence was actually kind of a relief. Bud was, he carried this weight with him. He had like big hands and wore a big ring, and his voice was big, and it grumbled like the gravel under the tires of the big pickup truck that he drove. His shoulders were big, and his bald head was big. He had this bigness, this air of menace that he carried with him. He loomed over you the way that you would imagine like John Wayne looming over you. Bud and Edith had 3 kids, my mom's brother Dick, her brother Tim, and my mom, Ann. She remembers when he would come off the road sometimes, like in the early 60s, he and my grandmother would go to the University of Nebraska football games in these like red blazers that nobody wears now. They took their friends Vic and Doris. They'd go to the football game all afternoon, and then they'd go out to dinner, and they would drink all night. And then Bud would go home and change clothes and go work the 3rd shift at the railroad, which, nowadays would get you fired. But back then, it made him, the toughest guy among the tough men on the railroad. At a certain point, it became clear that he was not entirely alone while he was out there on the road. My grandmother even found out this woman's name, and she confronted him and said, "You need to get transferred to a different job on the railroad that brings you home. And he did. And things got better for a while. Went on like that. He eventually retired. He had some grandchildren. But his drinking got worse and worse. The thing about drinking is that some people don't know when to stop. But also, people don't know when to tell you to stop. Very abnormal things can seem normal if you see them every day. And if you see them every day, how do you know when enough is enough? And do you want to be the one who tells him? Did you know that John Wayne's real name is Marion Morrison? He was born in Winterset, Iowa. John Wayne was a fiction. He just made that up. I kind of think that my grandfather made himself up too, invented himself. Maybe it was because he missed out on World War II because he had flat feet. Or maybe it was because he never got the life he thought he deserved. Or maybe like a million men of his generation, he just didn't know at all who he was. But whatever the reason, there was like this emptiness inside of him. And he seemed to fill it with booze and cigarettes and meanness until it created this shell around him that would not allow anyone to hurt him. But of course, that's a fiction too, right? Every year on Christmas Day, we would go to my mom's Aunt Fran's house. Fran was Edith's sister, and Fran had married Graydon, and Graydon had become paralyzed in an airplane accident. So everybody came to Graydon on Christmas, so Graydon didn't have to travel. Bud loved Graydon. My mom remembers on this particular year collecting her children and her husband and saying goodbye to everybody and going out the door at Fran's, and there was Bud sitting outside smoking a cigarette. He followed us to our car and wished us another Merry Christmas. And she remembers looking over her shoulder into the rear view and seeing him standing there in the middle of the road. She waved. A couple days later, Edith woke up and found a note. It said that he had gone to the dry out, which was his way of saying that he was going to try to get help, and that he'd be in touch. He wasn't in touch. And Edith got worried because she figured he had just driven out into a cornfield and shot himself. So reluctantly, she called the police and she went over to her desk and she pulled out a little slip of paper and unfolded it and gave them that woman's name and her address. And sure enough, he had gone out there and collected her and driven to California to visit his brother. He'd had a mild heart attack and was now back at her place recuperating, and that's where the police found her. And that's where he stayed. He would show up every once in a while. One time he came in the middle of the night, didn't tell anybody, to my parents' house and dumped off a whole pickup load of old antiques that he thought my mom would like. This was his love language, I guess. Edith got a boyfriend. His name was Albert. He did not drink, and he liked to shoot pool, and he adored her. He would have married her in a heartbeat. But he never did, because they never got divorced. Now, if I were to tell you that someone in this story is going to get a debilitating, degenerative neurological disease that is going to ravage their body and mind, you would hope that it would be the degenerate, philandering alcoholic who ruined everybody's life. But you would be wrong. My mom cared for her mother in the nursing home as Parkinson's disease tore Edith apart. My mom says that she felt like a failure until her very final days because she couldn't make him stay. Well, one day my mom was going to visit her in the nursing home, and she came around the corner and looked in the window of my grandmother's room, and there he was. sitting by her bed and holding her hand. I think that my mom wanted to confront him and say, no, you do not get to do this. You do not get to come here and have this moment. You don't get to try to make this right after all the things that you've done to us. But she didn't. She just turned around and left. She went to Target. And she left Bud and Edith there to have their last moments together.